So my name is Ayana Webb. I'm a program manager here at Evergreen, and I work leading social innovation labs predominantly in the areas of civic commons and infrastructure. We do this because we do quite a bit of work in civic commons. And our work in civic commons, first of all, let me define that for you, is all of the things that create community benefit in our communities that are sort of common, that provide social economic opportunities, that community build, and that support residents in building the connections and opportunities that they need. And so that includes libraries and parks, which are sometimes the iconic civic commons, schools, community centers, and such. But it also includes some organizations doing really interesting work in adding value to residents and communities, and we'd like to showcase some of this work. So this webinar belongs to our Civic Commons Catalyst series, and the Civic Commons Catalyst series is a new initiative of Future Cities Canada, which will offer an array of programming seeking to support and scale civic initiatives, to prototype new participatory models, to support resident-led activities, and to really create cohesion within our communities. Because we define civic commons as the backbone of our city, part of this work is really supporting civic commons and being everything that they can be. And so through this webinar, we try to showcase really interesting models that are happening within our civic commons that are providing those opportunities to residents and really trying something new across Canada. So in the past, we've showcased organizations from Winnipeg who are really centering Indigenous wisdom and using different participatory processes to create value, to reduce infant mortality, and to support community solutions. We've also showcased community centers that are providing opportunities for resident participation, and we've showcased some organizations doing really interesting work in adaptive reuse projects, taking old or vacant buildings and providing them at subsidized rent to community hubs who could really use spaces like that for less money. Today, I'm really excited that we're going to have a new kind of conversation around civic engagement. We've got our wonderful guests, Stefan Crystal of Synapcity and Jean Chen of BetaCityYEG. And really, we're talking about the tremendous variance in the levels of enthusiasm and proficiency within civic engagement and how it's carried out across different communities. And because we know that it's incredibly inconsistent, these little innovations that exist in these organizations is really exciting. So they support actual effective policy and decision-making through both educating residents and providing them opportunities to plug in and build the cities that they want to live in. And so today I'm so excited to be introducing them. And I'll do that in a second. So just as a refresher in terms of logistics of this webinar, we did book 75 minutes. And it is a 60-minute webinar from 12 p.m. to 1 p.m. We booked 75 minutes within the Zoom app just because it allows us to make sure that we don't drop off at 1 o'clock. It is not, however, an indication that it will run longer than our intended programming. We are scheduled from 12 to 1 p.m. You'll be able to ask questions. We also send out an email to you asking if you have any questions ahead of time. So we usually source a few from there. You'll be able to ask questions throughout if you need to by just using the chat function on the Zoom app. So at the bottom of your Zoom, you'll see a little speech bubble. And if you click on that, you can send direct messages either to me or to the entire group. And the ones that are sent to me, I will not announce who actually asked the question. If you send it to the entire group, I will. So feel free to drop questions there. There will be some dedicated time to ask questions at the end of the webinar. But if you're asking a question around what an acronym means or something that we can answer on the fly, I will get to it as our speakers are talking so that you'll get your answer right away and be able to be immersed in the content. Lastly, if you're having any tech problems throughout this process, please email jlafren at evergreen.ca. She'll be dropping her email address in the chat, so you'll get your practice at using it right now. But she also has been sending you emails to remind you of this webinar until today, so you would already have the contact. So if you get kicked from the webinar, or if you otherwise need support in hearing me or engaging properly, please do feel free to either message her on the chat function or email her if you can. Wonderful. So I've given you a little bit of an overview of the Civic Commons Catalyst and define Civic Commons for you. I can also drop that in the chat if that supports anybody. And I'd like to now introduce our speakers. Today we're talking to Stéphane Cressot. Born and raised in Ottawa, Stéphane's background is in ethics and civic education. He's currently program director at Synapcity, a nonprofit civic education organization and consulting agency in Ottawa. Stéphane has consulted for various civic projects in Ottawa and across Canada. He specializes in civic literacy education, curriculum design, public engagement strategies, and community resilience. Welcome, Stéphane, and thanks for being with us today.
Thank you, Ayana.
Yeah, from BetaCityYEG, I'd like to welcome Eugene Chen. Eugene is the co-organizer of BetaCityYEG, the oldest civic tech meetup in Canada, and is a member of Edmonton's Open Data Citizen Advisory Board. Having started in open data since a hackathon 9 years ago, he has since presented and taught at local, provincial, and national open data summits and events, recently moderating a panel on AI at the International Open Government Partnership Summit in 2019. In his professional capacity, Eugene is the CTO of Dark Horse Analytics, a predictive analytics and data visualization firm in Edmonton, and enjoys building award-winning visualizations and tools using open data like worldchatclock.com, mapinseconds.com, and babynames.dha.io, which I just got a chance to play with and is actually phenomenal. So thank you for being here and welcome, Eugene. So with that, we're going to just go straight into our speakers' prepared presentations. And in about 25 minutes, we'll open it up to the floor for any questions that you have or comments. And remember to please use the chat throughout if you want to bookmark your questions for later. So take it away, Stéphane.
Cool, thank you, Ayana. Welcome. It's a pleasure to be chatting with all of you. Ayana mentioned that I have about 12 minutes max, and I could go on and on about this subject. So I will try to be brief. To start, one of our slogans is "A city is its people," and for those who may have a background in English literature, that's coming from Shakespeare, who in one of his plays, a character says, "What is a city but its people?" And this is something that we often forget when we do a consultation process. We'll find cities, municipalities asking people what they think, but treating people as a customer and not as those who are inherently the fabric of a city. And so really our raison d'être is to ensure that people have a voice in the city, but that's not just lip service, that's actually meaningful and has tangible outcomes, which can be quite the challenge. Next slide. So really our mission is to energize and activate people and institutions to work together as city makers. Synapcity was founded about 10 years ago, and our initial name was Citizens Academy. And we didn't start off as an organization that did consultation. We were primarily a civic education organization. Our founders saw that there was a gap, especially in Ottawa, of municipal literacy. A lot of people in Ottawa understand how the federal government works, but when it comes to planning, infrastructure, when it comes to transportation, the level of literacy is quite low compared to federal government. So Citizen Academy was founded, and we created a 6-week program that would teach citizens how everything works. So how planning decisions are made, what are municipalities, how they're related to provincial governments, how the budget works, etc. And slowly what we recognized by having so many people in the room and engaging institutions like municipal governments, but also civil society organizations to come in and teach citizens, we noticed that this was a perfect platform for consultation and co-creation. So next slide. And so we became what we're Synapcity, and essentially Synapcity is a compound word, synapses and city. And we started recognizing that our value add in the city of Ottawa was that we were bringing people and institutions together to become empowered, have a new hope and new desire to engage with the city, to form new connections between people, but also between city staff, city councilors, civil society organization, and then also creating a platform for people to affect change. And so this is really our theory of change, is that we find ourselves as community brokers between people and institution, where both of our clientele, so to speak, want to work with the city and want to engage with people, but don't necessarily know how. And so we create a process that enables people to come together to create the city that they want. And ultimately, what we aim to do is to renew social trust. We're recognizing more and more that that there is that one negative story, whether in Ottawa right now we have an issue with our light rail transit system, but any kind of issue with government, that can break down social trust. And so we want to create a process where we increase social trust, where people are able to have a sense that institutions want to hear from people, but we also help institutions to better collaborate with the people that they serve. Next slide. And so really at the backbone of our process, what we try to do is to go from a consultation stage that is about informing to a co-creation stage that is about collaborating. So what does that look like? Very often when we see municipalities do community consultations, we're stuck in that first stage where it's an information session. And so what will be a likely scenario that I'm sure many of you have seen is there is an event on a Tuesday evening, and it's advertised as a consultation session. And what you get is a city staff or someone who really wants to engage with people, but you get a slide deck and you get all of this information of what's going to happen, but not really in a short Q&A session at the end, but not really an opportunity to listen to people, to really get to hear people's perspectives and whatnot. And so what we try to do is to help institutions go through a process where it starts off at the information stage, then goes through listening to people, respecting them, and then ultimately creating a platform where there can actually be collaboration and a particular tangible outcome. And so really it's the process from a mere consultation to co-creation. Next. So I'm going to go through 4 examples of this process. Earlier on in one of our programs, we brought a bunch of residents together to learn about how the city works. And part of the work that they were doing was to look at what are the pressing issues in the city. And obviously sustainability and the environment are very important issues. But often these are such systemic issues that residents, when they want to start working on a particular project or something, you don't know where to start. And so we had a group come together and they started recognizing that there was an issue with toilets. Ottawa's downtown had about like 9 public toilets, which is not acceptable for a mid-sized city. And so they created an advocacy organization through our project called the Gotta Go campaign. And they learned the tools to engage and receive the network or access the network to advocate for more public washrooms. And one of their big successes was with our LRT stations is they were able to advocate for 5 public washrooms in 5 of the LRT stations, which there are 12 in Ottawa. So that was a huge success for them, and really just the power of bringing residents together to start exploring what are some of the issues and what are some of the tangible victories or the low-hanging fruit that they can grab to feel like they're part of the city and that they have a huge impact in the city. Next slide. Another example of work that we've done, in particularly connecting a civil society organization to people to create change. There's an organization here in Ottawa called Just Food that does food justice. To give you a bit of context, if you're not from Ottawa, Ottawa is 80% rural, which means that we have lots of farmland. But most of our farmland is corn that's exported. So cash crops. And so Just Food, what they encourage is to promote local food production and encourage farmers to produce or to produce local fruits and vegetables, and to help businesses carry local foods. And what we looked at is we engaged some residents to look at ways to promote local food. And they noticed that there was a gap between local food and international or international food markets. And so what we noticed was, what they noticed actually, was that there was a disconnection between a lot of food stores in our Chinatown and local farmers. And so what would happen is that our ethnic food stores would carry fruits and vegetables that were imported that could easily be grown in our local farms. And so they noticed that gap, and they identified that gap, and they explained to, or they presented a plan for the Just Food, the organization, to engage, to help equip these local businesses to promote local local produce, but also at the same time to engage local farmers to know how to grow specialty fruits and vegetables in our climate. And so that was a huge beneficial gap, and it's something that was addressing at the same time local food issues in our city, but also food access and food health. So looking at the success of bringing residents together and being able to identify gaps, and seeing even when you're an organization that is an advocacy organization that has a particular expertise, there are gaps when you're viewing something, an issue, in a microscopic way. Next slide. So our city, so admittedly, the city of Ottawa does not have the best reputation for our nightlife, even though we love our city. Nationally, sometimes we get a bad rep, and City Hall is very aware of this. So we worked with the economic development team at City Hall to look at what are ways to promote the night economy. So essentially, the night economy is any economic activity that happens between 6 p.m. and 6 a.m. So it's not just nightclubs, but it has to do with bylaws, with grocery stores, with economic production, like the production of goods, anything under that umbrella that happens between 6 p.m. and 6 a.m. And so the city of Ottawa was debating whether or not they should develop a night strategy or night economy strategy. And so we engaged residents to explore what would a night strategy look like, where can be areas in the city that they could test it, particularly recognizing that there are noise bylaws in certain neighborhoods and whatnot. And so our residents came up with a plan and presented that to the city on developing the strategy. And afterwards, understandably, that City Hall moves quite slowly and bureaucratically. they have approved a plan to do to further their night strategy and to do more research and more consultations. And so really Synapcity in our process was used as the first stepping stone towards developing a night economy strategy and encouraging City Hall to invest or to put time and energy in that project. And final slide. And so for those who know Ottawa, we have a neighborhood on the east side of downtown called Vanier. And Vanier is it's a historical neighborhood, but it's also it was its own city until 2001, and when we had our amalgamation. And Vanier historically is a French Canadian community, so French Canadian businesses, a working class community, because the French Canadians of Ottawa were traditionally working class, and at the same time, it was, considering geographic space, it's an affordable neighborhood. It's a neighborhood that a lot of newcomers have come to. We have a large Indigenous population in that neighborhood, and so it has become an extremely diverse community. At the same time, it's a community that has been perceived as one of poverty and one of prostitution. And so there's a lot of debate and discussion on how to revitalize without gentrification, without ensuring that we push out the local businesses, that we push out people. And so we worked with the business improvement area, that's led by an Indigenous woman, and we looked at ways that could improve the culture of the neighborhood, while ensuring that and maintaining the cultural heritage and maintaining the affordability of the neighborhood. And so we had residents look at ways of digitizing Montreal Road, of digitizing the street, and it's proposed that there are going to be 3 public squares in the neighborhood, representing, the 2 of them representing a heritage. So there's going to be an Indigenous square and a French Canadian square. And the idea was that they would, the idea that our participants shared with the BIA was to create Wi-Fi nodes in each of the squares that would give access, that would give free access to Wi-Fi to anyone on the street, but at the same time would create a landing page for the local businesses and organizations and initiatives that are happening around Montreal Road. So that would encourage really that culture and an awareness of the culture. So that would be the first main street in Ottawa that would have gone digital. So the BIA took that and applied for a grant and received it from Ottawa Tourism to eventually install these nodes. And so again, using that consultation, that information and that advice from residents, they were able to justify and show the need to potential funders and to actually get work done. And at the same time, what we're trying to do is to showcase that there are these organizations, there are these institutions that value what you have to say. And then we, as Synapcity, our job is to go back to those who gave advice and gave recommendations to show, well, here is how what you shared is being applied in your city, and this is how you are participating in the co-creation of your city. Next slide. So really, that's how we ensure that social trust is built. It's all about creating those pathways for communication between people and institutions, but also showcasing those victories and ultimately showcasing that the people are making the city. And next slide. Thank you so much. I look forward to your questions and chatting more.
Thank you so much, Stefan. And just a reminder to our audience, if you do have any questions that arose as a result of Stefan's talk, feel free to dump them now into the chat, and we can prioritize and group or theme based on what kinds of questions you receive. With that, I want to say we're switching gears, but I don't feel like we are, because part of Eugene's conversation is, yes, tech is a tool, but if we apply it properly, then there's a large social component that goes along with it that is really what we are engaging people on, and tech is just meant to facilitate that. So with that, I'd like to move on then to Eugene Chen of BetaCityYEG. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Ayana. Thanks for that last talk, Stefan. Hi, everyone. All right, let's see here. I'd like to just talk a little bit about BetaCityYEG, some things that we've learned, give you a high-level overview of who we are, some of the projects that have come out as a result, and I'm hoping this could be useful for you to consider how you might be able to get civic engagement on your projects that you're working on. So I'll go next. About us, BetaCityYEG is a meetup group that meets every once a month for, I think, basically outside of the summer. And we do a number of things. We do 3 things in particular. And next. First thing that we do is we do community talks. We end up bringing people who have backgrounds from, it could be talks from social enterprises, from startups or academia. In this case, you see Ashley talking about her thesis work on gamifying volunteerism. And we also provide kind of like relevant projects or relevant events that are going on, as well as an idea of projects that we have that people can participate in. Next. Another thing that we do have talks about is our talks from government. So I put here City of Edmonton projects. We have Norman here from the city who's talking, in this case, about kind of a different way of trying to get smaller organizations to participate in an RFP-like process, but without going through kind of the bureaucracy of procurement. And it's a way to get citizens who are interested in the city to kind of look at what's going on and have kind of a sneak peek of projects or initiatives that are going on. As a more recent example, we actually had the Digital Innovation Office from the Alberta government talk about some of the projects they are undertaking to try and improve services from for citizens. I just remember like one good example that they had was they were trying to update certain applications and web apps that were using Netscape Navigator and Internet Explorer, I think 5. That's how old some of the technology was, and the office was talking about some of the new approaches they were trying to put in to try and replace that system. And it was great to hear the back and forth from the community or the attendees on questions on how the app would function, how it would work. And it's also great feedback for people on the government side too. And then next, finally, you have the third thing, which is working on projects. And that's what I'm going to be focused on talking a little bit more about today. And I'm hoping to allude to a point later because they're more relevant for projects. But essentially, our attendees come in, and sometimes people have ideas for projects. They may come from even the municipal government. They may come from people who are just interested in building something and improving the community in some way with technology. And so what you see here is a microcosm of some of the work that's been done. Next. And next. So some of the projects briefly are, there's one here. It's a really straightforward and simple project. There's no technical ability that you need for this, where we have a 360-degree camera, and we have people who are interested in volunteering to just walk through the river valley or walk through paths, and it'll just automatically take pictures and videos, and we can upload these onto Google Maps so that now these paths, we have essentially pictures showing you what the park would look like. And then next. This is a project that was from Link SF, which is Link San Francisco. Either way, it's a project to allow people who are in need to go on this website to check out services that are available close to them and they are open. So if someone's in need of food and it's 2 in the morning, they can look at this app and see what services are open that could potentially help them at this time. And what's interesting about this, beyond kind of a media coverage that came along with this, is in terms of a technical project, this is fairly straightforward because it ended up basically cloning from an open source project that a different community had already done. Next. And then there's this project. It's kind of a light exhibit, which took code from, if you're familiar with If This and That, someone from BetaCityYEG, one of the attendees, had written down some code to change the color of a light bulb, the hue light bulbs, based on the air quality that was the air quality in the city. So it gets, just basically changes color. But what was fascinating about this is an artist took the concept and took the idea and built a little bit of, as you can see, a little bit of an exhibit, art piece. And like some of the other projects that we have done at Beta City, it also ended up getting into the news and the media. And it was a good way to showcase that. And in terms of technical effort, it's somewhat moderate just because you need to know how to code with it, this and that, but it wasn't too bad. Next. There's this project called You Can Benefit, which and one of the attendees for BetaCityYEG decided to build after looking at opportunities to try and improve or help the community. And in this case, it's just this website that you can go onto and just say, hey, it's a questionnaire that people can fill out to see what services are available for them. And what's fascinating about this project is this is completely written from scratch from someone who attended the BetaCityYEG meetups. And it's become enough of a service that the city of Edmonton has actually taken this open source code base and they've now run it as a service from the city of Edmonton. So it's a little bit unique in that regard because it's just something that the community built and it's become an essential service. And then next slide. The final project I wanted to briefly touch upon is this data visualization of every single property or every single building in Edmonton, and that manages to encompass about a few 100,000 buildings. Now, the data from our open data portal became open, and this was built. And what's interesting about this is it kind of pushes the forefront of technology. So I kind of start off with really simple examples where people could participate with no technical knowledge. And this is probably on the extreme case where this visualization ended up being kind of used, this is using Mapbox. So Mapbox ended up kind of highlighting this project, and it's kind of a, I would say, a little bit more on the bleeding edge side of technology side of thing, where people had the opportunity to innovate because of the data that was there to basically visualize a couple 100,000 property assessments. And it's really neat if you actually get to play with it. It's available for Vancouver as well as Edmonton and San Francisco. But if you click on any property, everything else gets visually compared to the property that you currently selected. Next. So one of the key learnings for this next is in talking with different groups, be they from nonprofit groups or different sorts of organizations that want to get citizens to participate. And I think a lot of open data kind of goals tends to be, oh, we want to get a community to participate. We want developers to come in to build things that become useful for the community. The reality is that that segment of the population is really small. I would say it's a 1%, but realistically speaking, it's a smaller than 1%, because I think it's technically 4% of the working population is in some sort of IT or development. But of those 4%, and a much smaller percent of people end up deciding that they will volunteer and participate and work on things like that. So it's a really small sliver of society. And what we've noticed next is that you get a much larger community of people who are learning, people who are students, people who are looking to change their careers, people who are looking to just, learn a new programming language, and they tinker with things. They may not be experts, but often expertise is born out of the need to create something and build something. And so we try to cater to that audience. And then next, and obviously the rest of the audience is just people who aren't technical. They are the largest slice of the population. And the question is whether or not you're able to try and reach out to and not be overly narrow, at least on the technical side, that you barely get any sort of movement on any sort of civic tech projects. And then next. So these align well basically with the trajectory of the projects that I showed you earlier, where you have ones that range from non-technical to basically needing people who are technical to build things. And then we go next. And the challenge is different. But what's also interesting in this sort of model too is next, that in order for people to get that expertise, we want to be able to almost transition and give them opportunities wherever they are in terms of their technical ability to be interested and participate. And maybe you go from someone who doesn't have any background but can do something like data entry for a project that we're working on. And then they start building some sort of, let's say, data analysis skill. And so they become more of tinkerers. And from that, they can build and work on other sort of projects, or look at other people who talk about these projects and then try and become more technical. And then once you're more of a technical person, you have the expertise to be able to work on larger projects or more advanced projects. And this kind of allows a greater group of people to feel like they are connected and can participate in something that can change or affect the community in a positive way without worrying about where they are in the technical skill realm. Next. And then I think one final thing I need to say is just like, I imagine anyone on this call will feel this way. You don't work in a vacuum. And for us, we've been really fortunate in having partners that can work, that are focused on different things. So the Edmonton Public Library hosts a yearly kind of, what do you call that? The International Open Data Day. They usually have some sort of a conference that goes on here where they do a lot of their focus on digital literacy. So they'll have people teach a particular technology, things like Tableau, things are, or maybe even Excel. But they focus on that so that we as a group don't need to focus on that. And then the City of Edmonton, again, this back and forth in terms of getting some feedback from us, but also allowing the participant and the attendees to feel like they are a little bit more connected and have an ability to make decisions. And then the Startup Edmonton gives a space, which is great. It's super useful to have a common place to meet. And then there's Code for Canada, which connects us to other civic tech hubs as well, and also to pick up the best practices. Next, and I think that's it. So you can find out more on the projects there.
Great. Thank you so much, Eugene, for that. I think you've both represented different forms of civic engagement and allowing residents to co-create value within the communities. At this point, I'd like to open it to the floor to ask the speakers any questions that you have or to start a discussion. You can use the chat box to share any questions you have, and I'll share them either thematically or first come, first serve, depending. If you wish to remain anonymous, direct your questions to me alone by using the personal drop-down messaging and selecting my name. So to kick it off, I have a question around your scope. How do you know it's your role? So a lot of the stuff that you've described is stuff that's adding value to your municipal community, to your community, even if you're not associating it with a municipality that exists within. And so one of the questions is around how do you define that this is your role and not that of the municipality to develop? And then once you've defined that that is your role, how do you or do you involve municipalities, especially, Stefan, if you're defining trust as a desired outcome of this process? What is the connection there? And maybe I shouldn't ask a three-parter. Maybe we start with that and I'll continue from there. Yeah.
Cool. Eugene, you want to start or you want me to go?
I'll start. It's fairly straightforward for us. We don't have very clear-cut lines in terms of who's responsible for what, or whether or not we're playing other people's kind of sandboxes. In general, as long as there is some connection to a community, that's really all we care about in terms of what we talk about and allow people to participate in. And yeah, there's no distinction, I suppose, is what I'm trying to say.
Cool. Yeah, I mean, it's a challenge to think about where Synapcity fits and whether what we do could be recreated at the municipality. I know that there's a lot of people who will approach what we do as saying, well, this should be something that's offered by a city. So whether it's like civic literacy, consultation, and we'll meet a lot of folks as well who will say, well, we can do that. We can do that work. For us, we think it's really important to have a neutral third party that, I don't want to say mediates, because there isn't, I wouldn't say there's an inherent conflict between people and institutions, but when you have an organization that can develop relationships at the grassroots, whether in communities and so on, and at the same time develop relationships and build trust within institutions, then you can almost level the playing field. And so when you're working with people, they know that you're not coming with this hidden agenda. You're not coming in with saying like, I'm gonna convince you that this particular perspective is the right one. Is that you're coming in, you're saying, I don't have a bias, and what I'm trying to do is to create the process where you can engage better with your city. And because we're coming in as a civil society organization, as a nonprofit organization, we can do that without having our hands tied by policy or by bureaucracy, etc. And so in that sense, but at the same time, to continue that question, it's really important for us to have those good relationships with the city, with institutions. And so what we'll try to do is get multiple perspectives within the institutions presented, whether it's like different city councilors who have different beliefs of what the city ought to be, and to create space for dialogue and discussion and discovery. And so when we do that, we've noticed that it can be quite successful to build trust between people and institutions.
That's great. And so I think through both of your processes, you do create value that then sometimes ends up being endorsed by the cities that you exist in, or things like that. But it might be more of a fluid consideration for some of the tech innovations that you're working on, Eugene, and maybe a precursor to some of the stuff that you're working on, Stefan, is to think about what that relationship is going to be and how you involve the city where, and to be more, I guess, intentional about that choice. Mm-hmm. That's great. Thank you. So the next question is from Christine Martin, and that is, what approaches have you found helpful in shifting institutions' decision-making to take more collaborative approaches with citizens? How do you convince them? Now, this was directed at Synapcity, but I do see some overlap with the work that you're doing as well, Eugene, so feel free to jump in.
So that's a challenge. I think the first step is to not see institutions, unless let's say City Hall, as a monolith, right? There are people within those institutions that we have to build relationships with, and they're the ones that you convince. You don't really convince the system, you convince the people that are part of that system. And so really a lot of our work behind the scenes is about relationship building with people within the institutions that are making the decisions, and convincing them at a human level, at like a heart-to-heart level. But in our process, so the way what we set up is almost, if we go back to that process where it was like informing to collaborating, is creating the space for information. And then often people are just happy to have a chance to meet with citizens. So an example is like, we'll bring people in the room that don't normally come to an information session on planning, for example. So in Ottawa, at least, and I could assume it's the same with many cities, is whenever there's a discussion on planning, you have the same kind of people who would be part of a community association, right? White, middle class people involved. What we do is to bring a diverse group of people together to get a chance to at least speak with institutions, with decision makers, and often at that stage when people are coming to give information, they start realizing, oh my God, I'm speaking to a bunch of people that I've never spoken to. I'm speaking to youth. I'm speaking to underrepresented individuals, underrepresented communities, people I don't normally speak to, and I'm hearing from them things that I've never heard before. And so really that first step starts recognizing, I would say, two things. One, that we're able to offer them something that they can't do otherwise themselves. And then that opens up for a longer conversation of saying, hey, do you want to keep working together so that we could create a process for co-creation? And then that could be through prototyping a particular thing with participants, and get us plugging people into a particular project or something like that. So really that's how we convince them. And then obviously storytelling and sharing successes, it kind of builds on that, right?
So I think essentially you're talking about putting your trust and relationships with both community and municipalities on the line, to be able to maybe breach or broach a new relationship that never existed, and create a new kind of value for both parties that never existed. Do you ever feel like your own organization's trust or ability to do that work is threatened by
I'll give you
outcomes, maybe?
So I'll give you an example of, we had this particular counselor that's a suburban counselor, so in Ottawa, and you know, like advocating for a larger roads, you know, because his constituents drive downtown, drive into work, come back, and so they're not thinking bike lanes, complete streets, that kind of stuff. They're thinking, I need to get let's expand the roads, right? Let's widen the roads. And when we invited him to speak to our group, he was so apprehensive, like, I'm not going to come speak to a bunch of activists and get yelled at, was kind of in so many words what he shared. And in speaking with him, I explained, you know, we try to get a diverse group of people, diverse opinions, and so on. And so just come, take off your city councilor hat and come as a resident of Ottawa that wants to make the city a better place to live. And even though there was like intense disagreement between people, afterwards, when he shared and he spoke and he spoke of his own challenges, and he was like upright and shared how difficult his job is. There was, afterwards, he really appreciated having the opportunity to speak with people who are disagreeing with him, but to actually hear them, to actually not just hear them as, oh, these are advocates yelling at me, but these are people who actually are very concerned with healthy transportation, are very concerned with safety. And so he was able to rethink certain things about his priorities. At the same time, people were also able to empathize and understand that there's a huge challenge for a city that where people need to commute an hour and a half to get to work every day and are living paycheck to paycheck in the suburbs. And so there's building that trust can have a huge impact on encouraging a collaborative approach.
So a lot of creating opportunities for empathy.
Absolutely, yeah.
I'm going to switch gears a little bit. We have a question from Paula Gallo, and I think this might be for both of you. How do you include children meaningfully in the projects that you have? And maybe we can start with you, Jean.
Sure. We've had children come to talk at one of our talks, I remember that. So we're just fairly open in terms of what people can come to do. But in terms of actual projects itself, we've tried to gear some of our projects to be more kid-friendly. So for instance, we have a Minecraft project for someone to take on. If they're interested in modeling some part of the city or maybe a building or something like that. Haven't gotten kids to do that. Maybe we're not reaching it as far as we need, but we try and encourage that sort of participation by looking at kid-friendly sort of projects that they can still participate in. That's all.
Yeah, I guess for us, we haven't if you say children are like under 13, we haven't actively included them, but I wouldn't say that we've actively excluded them. But we have a strong partnership with a similar organization here in Ottawa called Youth Ottawa, and a lot of working with younger people in schools. You need to go through the school boards, and that requires a lot of trust. It requires, I'm speaking a lot about trust, but it also requires official partnerships, and there's school boards are apprehensive to just include everybody to come to classes. And so this particular organization, Youth Ottawa, has a very good relationship with the school boards and actually teach courses in civics. And so we've been able to include youth, 14-year-olds, to come to some of our consultations through our partnership. So we didn't have to go through the school board. So a lot of that work for us is institutional partnerships, and looking at which organization is equipped or is able to reach out to a segment of the population that we might not be able to reach out to.
That's really great. So being able to partner towards inclusion is definitely an approach there. And I think I'm hearing a little bit around like what might need to change around the projects that you do on a day-to-day basis. What does that look like to meaningfully include children in everything? Because I know, Eugene, some of your projects are very technically based, and so it'd be interesting to think about how do you make that accessible to the person who's the fringest user of it.
Right.
Thank you for that question, Paula. I've got a question from Andrea Hemmerich. Hope I pronounced your name right. For Synapcity. What strategies do you use to create a shared vision among stakeholders who may have different conflicting priorities? And I think this actually is a question for Eugene as well. I think when you get to the point of actually developing a tech solution, there's a lot of consensus building that happens before that process. So to both of you, but let's start with Stefan.
Yeah, that's a good question, and it's a difficult question. I say it's the strategies change depending on which stakeholders we're working with. Some of our work really includes a lot of prep work, and so say we're facilitating a conversation where different stakeholders have a different vision for in a particular neighborhood, which we've done. A lot of it is recognizing, well, what are the commonalities? What is already shared? And so approaching on acknowledging that we agree on more than we disagree is a good first step. And usually we find that's really, I'm glad that you still have that slide, but that's really the respecting slide, right? It's like, I'm going to hear you out. I'm going to get an idea of where we come together. And then the conflict starts being on the understanding phase. And so really that's when it will happen in a group, and you'll get all of these perspectives out. In some cases, a shared vision doesn't mean necessarily a unified vision. And I think that it's really important to recognize that when we say a city is its people, we're not going to come into a one vision for the city, but recognizing like what are the trade-offs that we can take, what are the things that we want to concentrate on together. And that's really where we have to start with a shared vision. But I think the key word here is shared vision is coming together, building energy, and working together towards collaborating and addressing a particular issue. But a unified vision could actually be dangerous to our democracy. And so we don't necessarily always try to encourage that, but actually to have people come out of a meeting or come out of a session recognizing that cities are complex systems. And because they're complex systems, there are certain aspects that we can share, and there's certain aspects that we're going to have to debate and discuss and prioritize.
Thank you for that. I feel like there's a quote in there somewhere around consensus building and a threat to democracy. So what I'm hearing is you kind of peel back to that common ground and then move forward from there, preserving that disagreement, because that's what makes the city what it is.
Yeah, absolutely.
Wonderful. Eugene, do you want to add to that?
There's not too much to add. I think the common ground thing makes sense for us too. At a meta level, when we talk to other groups, they're usually interested in different things, and there isn't typically that much conflict. There may be slight disagreements, but we're generally trying to move in the right direction of trying to improve our community in some way. And people don't take it personally if we decide to go in one decision or another, given that the overall goal is to improve the community. And then at a more granular level, when it comes to projects, it's less of a concern as well, because they're not mission critical applications or projects. It's almost like the participation of working together is itself part of the reward, and you end up building something, right? So there isn't that much charged opinion, not so many charged opinions when it comes to a number of our projects. That's it.
Thank you, Eugene. So I want to thank you both for contributing to this conversation, bringing your presentations and sharing your organizations. I think there's a lot to learn from here, and I think there are a lot of questions or conversations happening around who owns the keys to the city, who gets to make decisions about how we live, and is that the municipality, is that the residents, is that community organizations, is it a combination of all, which is often the moderated answer that I tend to lean towards. And then if it is a combination of all, what does that look like? And so it's always heartening to have organizations that create the space for people who may not understand how our cities work and want to contribute to it, or who have ideas on how to improve their communities and make them more livable for them, which is what placemaking is about, and where you create the process for that. So thank you for joining us. So thank you everybody for joining us. Stefan and Eugene are just one or just some of several people, practitioners in the area of civic commons who are adding value to our communities and ensuring that residents have opportunities for participation, for engagement, and for belonging. So our next webinar is on Tuesday, December 10th from 12 to 1, and it's about celebratory spaces. We'll be sending a follow-up email with a summary of this webinar and information on how to stay up to date on upcoming ones. So definitely continue to follow us monthly in a series of sharebacks from Civic Commons, daring to do things differently and leading the way with unique participatory initiatives. If you're interested in being showcased and you're from a Civic Commons that you think fits into this whole gamut, reply to our follow-up to this webinar and we'll get in touch to explore your involvement. And so with that, I just want to thank Stefan and Eugene sincerely for being with us and sharing a bit of themselves, and to thank our audience for being with us, and bid you all adieu. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
If you guys have questions for me or things about Beta City, just go to betacity.ca. Just a quick plug. So if you, yeah, happy to help.
I love quick plugs.
Yep.
All right. Take care, everybody.
Thanks a lot.